What if the history we've learned, the one etched into our textbooks, our understanding of ancient ruins, what if it isn't quite the full story? Imagine if entire centuries, maybe even millennia, are actually misplaced, and figures we think of as ancient. Well, what if they're really just echoes of medieval times? Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a really provocative theory. It's known as the New Chronology, and it's primarily championed by the Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko and his colleagues. This theory, it radically suggests that the conventional timeline, for European and Middle Eastern history, fundamentally flawed.
Right. It posits that many events we traditionally date way back to ancient civilizations actually occurred much, much later, like during the Middle Ages. They claim reliable written human history only really extends back to about 800 AD, and most significant events, they get condensed between 1000 and 1500 AD. It's a massive reshaping.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the core arguments and some of the, well, intriguing, often startling evidence presented by the proponents of this new chronology. We'll be drawing directly from Fomenko's foundational work, The Issue with Chronology. We'll explore their critiques of established historical methods, the sources. But importantly, we're not taking a side here. We're simply aiming to illuminate the ideas contained in the original source material for you. Okay, so let's unpack this. So to really get what the new chronology is challenging, we first need to look at the foundation, the bedrock of our current historical timeline.
Yeah, exactly. And that's largely attributed to Joseph Justus Scaliger and Dionysius Batavius. They were scholars back in the 16th and 17th centuries. They constructed what the new chronology folks call the Scaligerian chronology.
Okay, Scaligerian chronology. And what's the issue Fomenko raises with this?
Well, what's particularly striking, according to Fomenko, is how this established version of ancient history, especially for the classical period and the Middle Ages, became sort of rigidified by the 17th century. Fomenko's work highlights that these foundational dates, these basis dates, were often just presented without explicit, verifiable reasons behind them.
Presented how? Like just stated as fact?
Pretty much. They were often declared to be based on ecclesiastical tradition, church tradition, or derived from these scholastic exercises with numbers from the Bible. You might recall figures like Archbishop James Ussher. He famously dated the world's creation with incredible precision. Sunday, October 23, 4004 BC, early in the morning.
Wow, yeah. That precise.
Right. And Fomenko sees this as illustrating the kind of precise yet potentially arbitrary dating that got embedded into the whole system.
And it's certainly worth noting, isn't it, that many of these key chronologists back then, Scaliger and Batavius, they were clergymen.
Absolutely. The new chronology really emphasizes that point. They assert that, quote, history has remained predominantly ecclesial for centuries, and for the most part was written by the clergy.
Which suggests, at least according to the theory, a kind of built-in bias, a religiously informed timeline from the get-go.
That's the implication they draw, yeah.
Okay, so if this timeline was largely constructed by clergy, based on tradition, biblical interpretation, were there challenges early on? Did people question this from the start?
That's a critical aspect the new chronology examines, and as it turns out, they emphasize that doubts about this consensual version, they weren't just a recent thing. Not at all.
Okay, so this isn't just Fomenko in the 20th century saying, hang on a minute.
No, they point back much earlier.
Right, that sets important context. These critiques aren't new or isolated. You mentioned scholars like de Arcila back in the 16th century.
Yeah, Salamanca University professor de Arcila, he argued that, quote, the entire history of the classical age was medieval in its origin.
Medieval in origin. That's quite a claim for the 16th century.
It is. And then a century later, you have the Jesuit Jean Hardouin. He held a similar, pretty radical view. He believed that classical literature, pretty much all of it, was actually written in monasteries during the preceding 16th century. So basically, recent forgeries in his time.
Wow. So these were scholars in their own era already seeing major inconsistencies.
Exactly. And this next point is, well, particularly compelling for the new chronology proponents, even Sir Isaac Newton.
The Isaac Newton. Physics, gravity.
Yes, that's Sir Isaac Newton. He actually undertook a radical revision of ancient chronology himself. It's in his work, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. He systematically moved many events forward in time. Things like the early reign of the Egyptian pharaoh Menes. He shifted it forward by about 2,000 years.
2,000 years?
Roughly, yes. And the Trojan War, he moved that forward by about 330 years.
That's huge. But didn't mainstream history kind of dismiss Newton's historical work?
Often, yes. Modern commentators frequently brush it aside, but the new chronology sees his conclusions as powerful evidence, evidence that, quote, the solution to the problem we're studying lies somewhere in this direction. It's almost like Newton, with his rigorous scientific mind, stumbled upon the same kind of chronological oddities that Fomenko later explored with mathematics.
And apparently Newton was even wary about publishing it.
He was. The text mentions he was wary of the plethora of complications that the publication of his tractate on chronology could lead him to, which tells you something, right, about how controversial these ideas were even back then.
Definitely. Okay, so fast forward a bit. Who else picked up this thread?
Well, jumping to the early 20th century, the new chronology considers Nikolai Alexandrovich Morozov, a prominent Russian scientist, as really the first to fully and radically raise the issue of providing a proper scientific basis for the standard chronology. He published this huge work, Christ, in 7 volumes. And he hypothesized that Scaliger's chronology had been artificially expanded, blown up, basically, based on repetitions, or what he called statistical duplicates in historical texts.
Statistical duplicates. Meaning
Essentially, the same historical events or figures were recorded multiple times, perhaps in different chronicles or contexts, but later historians dated them as entirely separate, distinct occurrences, stretching the timeline out.
Okay, I see. And how was Morozov's work received?
The pushback was intense. His work caused so much controversy. Apparently, he needed direct support from high-up figures like Lenin and Dzerzhinsky just to get it published. And eventually, his further materials were suppressed. It shows how entrenched the traditional view was.
And more recently, are there others?
Yes, more recently, they point to German scientists like Uwe Topper and Heribert Illig. They have published critical analyses, too. Illig is famous for proposing that, quote, one needs to withdraw about 3 centuries from the medieval history.
3 centuries?
Yeah.
Just remove them.
Including Charlemagne's age, yeah. Illig views many documents from that specific era as later forgeries, created to fill this invented gap.
Okay, wow. So it really highlights that this isn't just one isolated voice. It's a recurring thread of questioning, stretching over centuries, involving some really significant thinkers.
So if we're questioning the architects of the timeline, what about the sources they actually used? Especially for something as foundational as, say, Roman history, how does the new chronology view the reliability of those ancient texts?
That's a crucial point Fomenko raises. He highlights that traditional Roman history primarily comes from a really small number of authors, most notably Titus Livy. And here's the kicker, according to Fomenko. Livy's original, complete work. It's lost. We only have summaries or fragments, mostly.
So we're relying on incomplete sources to begin with. Exactly. And even mainstream critics like Theodore Mommsen back in the day noted things like numeric inveracities in the surviving texts.
Numeric inveracities.
Yes.
Meaning the numbers just don't add up.
Right. Factual inconsistencies in dates, length of reigns, army sizes, things like that. Stuff that just didn't seem plausible or consistent. And Mommsen also mentioned ghostly rulers.
Ghostly rulers.
Yeah, figures who seemed to exist solely to fill chronological gaps in the king lists, but had little to no other verifiable historical footprint. It's like they were inserted to make the timeline work.
The implication being, these aren't just minor errors, but maybe symptoms of a history that was constructed, or at least heavily edited, to fit a certain timeline.
That's certainly the conclusion the new chronology draws. They see these as signs of artificiality.
And beyond that, is there an issue with the manuscripts themselves?
Fomenko points out there's a curious lack of surviving Roman manuscripts from the supposed period. Most presumptions are based on what they call very poorly represented annalist material, basically, later chronicles piecing things together. And they also highlight what they term an ultra-skeptical stance, questioning the basic veracity of the chronology of regal Rome, that earliest period. It seems the deeper you dig into the sources, according to this theory, the less solid the ground feels.
Okay, so we've got critiques of the timeline's architects, critiques of the early questioners, and critiques of the foundational texts like Roman history. What about the science? The dating methods we rely on today?
Right. So we've explored the historical critiques and the issues with traditional textual sources, but what about the supposedly hard science we use to date artifacts? The new chronology turns its critical eye to basically all the widely accepted methods for dating ancient sources and artifacts. We're talking archaeological dating, dendrochronology, radiocarbon, numismatics. And their claim is that these methods are either fundamentally flawed, not precise enough, or, and this is crucial, inherently dependent on the very traditional chronology they're supposed to be independently verifying.
Okay, that's a big claim. Let's break that down, starting with archaeological dating.
Okay. The new chronology argues this method is, quote, heavily dependent on the a priori datings of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh dynasties.
A priori meaning assumed beforehand.
Exactly. Assumed before the archaeological finds are even dated, they describe it like a chain of dominoes. If the initial dating of those key Egyptian pharaohs is off, if that first domino falls, then the rest of the chain, which is built upon that Egyptian foundation for dating things across the ancient world, also falls.
It's a house of cards, in their view, dependent on that initial Egyptian dating.
That's the analogy they use, yeah. If the base is wrong, the whole structure built on it is questionable. And this example they use is, well, it's truly captivating. Pompeii.
Right. Buried by Vesuvius, 79 AD. Everyone knows that date.
Well, the new chronology says, hold on, it presents some startling contradictions, according to them. They cite a 15th century author, Jacopo Sannazaro, who wrote about seeing Pompeii's towers, quote, untouched by the centuries, as if it were still standing, or at least visible, much later.
A 15th century author seeing Pompeii, that doesn't fit 79 AD.
Not at all. And then there are the archaeological finds from Pompeii. They point to frescoes and inlays of a very high artistic level, strikingly resembling Renaissance masters like Raphael or Giulio Romano.
Renaissance style in 79 AD.
That's the puzzle they highlight. And they also found advanced surgical instruments, apparently, and a sundial with uniform hourly divisions, a level of precision they argue wasn't common even in the late Middle Ages, let alone the 1st century.
Okay, that's weird. But maybe the most curious thing
is the graffiti found on Pompeii walls. Apparently, it clearly depicts medieval scenes.
Medieval graffiti in ancient Pompeii. Like what?
Like a hooded henchman dragging a victim onto a scaffold, or a warrior wearing a helmet with a visor, that kind of knightly gear. Equipment distinctly invented in the Middle Ages, centuries after 79 AD.
So what's the new chronology's explanation for all this?
They put forth a hypothesis that Pompeii isn't ancient Roman at all, that it's actually a medieval town, perhaps destroyed by later Vesuvius eruptions, maybe the one in 1500 AD or 1631 AD.
And the ancient artists were actually contemporaries of Raphael.
That's their radical suggestion, yes. For them, this isn't just a quirky historical anecdote. It fundamentally challenges the neat separation of historical epochs. It suggests our archaeological interpretations might be forced to fit a pre-existing, possibly incorrect timeline.
Okay, Pompeii is definitely food for thought. What about other archaeological puzzles they raise?
Well, if Pompeii wasn't enough to make you pause, they bring up the Cologne Cathedral.
The famous Gothic cathedral in Germany. Construction started in 1248 AD, right? Took centuries.
That's the traditional story, but the new chronology points to a technical brochure about the cathedral structure, and it apparently shows that the vast majority of the actual masonry, the stonework, dates from after 1826.
After 1826, not medieval.
Most of it, according to this brochure they cite, only a small, fragmented part apparently dates from the actual medieval period, 1248 to 1560. And there's this gap. An absence of construction documented between 1560 and 1825. That's nearly 300 years of silence for what was supposed to be a major ongoing building project. They find that suspicious.
And how does that tie into their larger theory?
It ties into their observation that many famous historical buildings are said to have these unnaturally prolonged construction periods. Like the Strasbourg Cathedral supposedly took 424 years.
Wow.
They suggest this is evidence of the traditional timeline stretching out historical reality, maybe combining different building phases or even different buildings into one long, continuous, but possibly fictional narrative.
Interesting. Okay, what other dating issues do they flag?
Then there's what they call the Bronze Age paradox.
Okay, Bronze Age, copper and tin. What's the paradox?
Well, bronze is an alloy, right? Copper plus tin. But traditional chronology places the Bronze Age before the widespread discovery and use of tin metallurgy. Tin is chemically more complex to smelt and work than copper.
So chronologically, we have the alloy before we mastered one of its key ingredients.
That's the paradox, according to traditional dating, yes. How can you have a widespread Bronze Age before you really figure out tin? The new chronology solution is simple. Redate it. They resolve this by positing that the Bronze Age, as we understand it technologically, actually falls much later, maybe within the 14th to 16th centuries AD, after tin metallurgy was properly developed.
So for them, it's not a paradox if you just shift the timeline forward.
Precisely. The problem disappears if the dates are wrong, they argue.
Okay, moving on from archaeology. What about dendrochronology? Tree ring dating. That seems pretty solid, doesn't it?
Well, the new chronology criticizes this method too. They note that the European dendrochronological scales, the master sequences of tree rings, have an obvious gap around all 1000 AD.
A gap, meaning they can't connect the sequences across that point.
Right. They can't be reliably continued further back in time without intervals, without breaks. So earlier fragments of tree ring sequences exist, but how do you place them accurately on the timeline before that gap? They argue that the placement of these earlier fragments often relies on matching them to events dated by the conventional Scaligerian chronology, which makes their absolute dating dependent on the very system being questioned, potentially erroneous.
So it becomes circular again, using the disputed history to date the tree rings that are supposed to verify the history.
That's the core of their critique, yes. And they also point out that even the long American dendrochronological scale, the 7,000-year one from bristlecone pines in California.
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
They say it cannot help ancient European and Asian dendrochronology in any way at all. The geographical distance is just too great to reliably correlate tree growth patterns across continents, so it implies the method is more regionally fragmented than often presented, especially for ancient European and Asian history.
Okay, dendrochronology question. What about the big one? Radiocarbon dating. C14. Surely that's objective science.
Radiocarbon. Here's something the new chronology finds particularly thought-provoking. They point out that the method's inventor himself, Willard F. Libby, he apparently didn't question the validity of the established Scaligerian dates. In fact, he used artifacts dated by that traditional chronology to calibrate his new radiocarbon method in the first place.
Wait, really? He used the old timeline to set up the new scientific dating.
That's what Fomenko argues. So if the calibration samples were misdated according to the old, potentially flawed chronology, then the entire radiocarbon scale built upon them could be skewed from the start. It bakes the old assumptions into the objective method.
That's a significant claim.
Yeah.
Do they cite issues with the results it produces?
Oh, definitely. Fomenko's research studies mainstream studies, sometimes showing significant issues. Things like random errors of 1,000, 2,000 years in some tests, and documented dating errors ranging from 600 to 1,800 years.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, there's this one they often mention, a mummy in the Manchester Museum. Its bones were radiocarbon, dated to around 1000 BC.
Okay.
But the linen cloth it was wrapped in, dated to about 380 AD. That's a 1,400-year discrepancy between the body and its wrapping.
Wow. How did mainstream science explain that?
The mainstream explanation offered was that the mummy must have been, quote, exhumed and rewrapped in a new cloth centuries later. The new chronology proponents find that explanation perfectly preposterous. They see it as an example of inventing unlikely scenarios just to make the anomalous dates fit the standard timeline instead of questioning the timeline itself.
Right, and perhaps the most famous example
is the Shroud of Turin. Radiocarbon dating placed it in the 11th to 13th centuries AD, which of course directly contradicts the traditional first-century dating of Christ's life.
Yeah, that caused a huge stir.
Absolutely. And for the new chronology, it forces this fascinating question. Could Christ's lifetime really have been the 12th century? For them, it's a piece of empirical scientific data that seems to support their radical redating of major historical events.
And they also criticize the practice of radiocarbon dating.
Yes, this is a huge criticism Fomenko levels against how it's often done. He alleges an, quote, unacceptable practice where archaeologists essentially communicate their expected age range for a finding to the physical laboratories before the dating is even performed.
So they're telling the lab what answer they expect to get.
That's the allegation, which, if true, obviously implies a potential bias, a circular dependency. The scientific dating might end up just reinforcing what's already assumed, rather than providing a truly independent verification. They argue that the method in its current state is most dubious for objects under 2,000 years old, which is precisely where historical interest is often highest, largely due to this lack of proper independent calibration with specimens of known, undisputed ages.
Okay, another major dating method under scrutiny. What about coins? Numismatic dating. How does that fit in?
Finally, we turn to numismatic dating relying on ancient coinage. This method, too, according to Fomenko, is wholly dependent on Scaligerian chronology.
Meaning the coins are dated based on who's depicted on them and where that ruler fits in the pre-existing timeline.
Exactly. You find a coin with Caesar's face, you date it to Caesar's time based on the established history. The coin doesn't independently date Caesar. Caesar's accepted date is used to date the coin. What the new chronology points to are abnormally large numbers of parallels and even direct coincidences between supposedly ancient coins and medieval coinage.
Similar designs, motifs?
Very similar, sometimes identical, which mainstream historians often explain away as simple imitation, medieval minters copying ancient designs.
Okay, that sounds plausible.
But Fomenko gives examples, like English Edwardian pennies from around 42-1066 AD. They are said to copy Constantinople solidi from 565-578 AD. That's a 450-year gap for imitation.
4.5 centuries. That seems like a long time to be imitating a specific coin design.
It does seem long. So the new chronology asks, maybe it's not imitation across centuries. Maybe these supposedly ancient coins are actually medieval themselves, and they've just been misdated and thrown back into the past because the ruler depicted was assumed to be ancient.
A completely different interpretation of why the similarities exist. Not imitation, but misdating.
Precisely. And they also highlight this mysterious medieval gap they perceive in coinage history. Between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries AD, high-value Roman or Byzantine-style gold coinage allegedly disappeared from Western Europe. They suggest the real birth of widespread European coinage might be much later, maybe the 13th century at the earliest, which, interestingly, is closer to the invention of book printing in the 15th century. It challenges the idea of a continuous, unbroken economic and monetary history stretching back from the Middle Ages to ancient Rome.
Okay, so dating methods questioned across the board. Let's shift gears slightly. If we're questioning the physical artifacts and the dating methods, what about the very words on the page, the ancient texts and maps that form our historical understanding?
Right. This is another fascinating area the new chronology scrutinizes. The texts themselves and the geographical descriptions within them. What's crucial to remember about many old manuscripts, think the Hebrew Bible, ancient Egyptian texts, is that they were initially written in consonants exclusively. No vowels written down.
Like Hebrew or Arabic today, just consonants.
Exactly. The vowels were added much, much later. By groups like the Masorets for Hebrew, maybe in the 7th or 8th century AD, or Fomenko suggests perhaps even as late as the 15th, 16th centuries when texts were being standardized for printing.
So what's the implication of adding vowels centuries later?
Think about it. Imagine reading a consonant sequence like, say, BLD. Without vowels, how do you know how it was originally pronounced or what it meant? It could be blood, bled, bold, build, ballad.
Ah, I see. Huge ambiguity.
Profound ambiguity. According to the new chronology, this could have led to hundreds of different possible vocalizations for the same consonantal text. And some of these interpretations, they argue, might have been arbitrarily chosen and localized, particularly pinning things down to the Middle East based on later assumptions.
It raises a fascinating question. How much interpretation, or even misinterpretation, might have crept into our understanding of these foundational texts when those crucial vocalizations were added so much later by people potentially distant in time and culture?
Precisely. And this ambiguity, they argue, has profound implications for understanding where biblical events actually happened.
So challenging the geography of the Bible.
Yes, one critical aspect the new chronology examines is whether the biblical events are really located where we traditionally think they are. Despite claims by some archaeologists to have confirmed biblical locations, Fomenko points out what he calls a chaotic situation, with widely varying scholarly views on dating and location issues, even within the mainstream.
Can you give some examples they raise?
Sure. For instance, they note a significant lack of clear archaeological evidence for the route of the Exodus. And Mount Sinai, the Bible describes it like a volcano, but its traditional location in the Sinai Peninsula isn't volcanic.
Okay. What else?
Cities like Sodom and Gomorrah, often placed in Mesopotamia, but that's an area without volcanoes. If the texts describe volcanic destruction, the location seems problematic. They also state there's no archaeological proof, or very disputed proof, for any biblical reports from the epoch of the Judges. Nor for the famous early kings like Saul, David, and Solomon. Their names haven't been found in contemporary inscriptions in the region, despite extensive searching.
No contemporary evidence for David or Solomon. That's surprising.
It is surprising, given their prominence in the text. And then there's Mount Ararat. Despite persistent legends and numerous expeditions, they point out that nothing definitive of Noah's Ark has ever been found. For Fomenko, this consistent lack of clear archaeological correspondence isn't just bad luck, it points towards potential misidentification or mislocation of the events altogether.
And does this questioning extend to the New Testament as well?
Yes, the traditional localization of New Testament events is also challenged. They cite a similar lack of archaeological proof for key sites in modern Palestine. Places like Jerusalem, which some Roman sources suggest was largely barren before being rebuilt as Aelia Capitolina, or Nazareth, Capernaum, even the traditional site of Golgotha. The archaeological evidence matching the gospel descriptions from the first century is often debated or considered ambiguous.
Are there alternative traditions for locations?
Interestingly, yes. They point out that the Catholic Church itself has a long-standing tradition, for instance, that the Virgin Mary's house miraculously flew to Loreto, Italy. This indicates that alternative locations for some key evangelical events have existed within religious traditions, suggesting that Palestine localization wasn't always the only accepted one.
So, based on all these geographical and textual discrepancies, what does the new chronology propose instead?
They propose a really radical relocalization that significant parts of the Bible, including maybe the journey of the Israelites, didn't happen in the Middle East, but actually took place in Europe, and particularly in Italy.
Italy. How do they justify that?
Well, beyond the lack of evidence in Palestine, they look for alternative fits. They even suggest, for example, that biblical Phoenicia might actually be medieval Venice.
Venice.
Based on phonetic similarities, partly. Phoenicia and Phoenicia sound somewhat alike. It's part of a broader attempt to find European settings that might match the descriptions better than the traditional ones. And this example really makes you pause and think about place names. Troy.
Homer's Troy, the Trojan War, near the
Right.
Hellespont in Turkey, right?
Yeah,
Schliemann found it.
that's the traditional view. But the new chronology cites evidence that the name Troy actually multiplied in the Middle Ages. It referred to different cities at different times. Homer's Troy, traditionally near the Hellespont, is apparently mentioned by medieval Byzantine historians as if it were still an existing town in their time, and the Roman historian Titus Livy actually placed Troy in Italy.
Livy put Troy in Italy.
So they claim, citing specific passages, and some medieval historians even identified Troy with Jerusalem, or sometimes with Constantinople. The name seems to have been quite fluid.
And Babylon. Same issue.
Similar story. Babylon was apparently located in Egypt in some medieval texts. It was also a frequently used name for Cairo in the Middle Ages, or sometimes even Baghdad. They point to a miniature painting from 1470 depicting the ancient Tower of Babel, but the city of Babylon around it. It's shown as a typically medieval Gothic town, and King Nimrod, the builder, portrayed as a medieval knight in plate armor.
Suggesting the 15th century artist wasn't thinking of some distant ancient past, but depicting his own contemporary reality.
That's exactly the interpretation, that for the medieval artist, ancient Babylon and its king look just like the medieval world around him.
Fascinating. What about maps? You mentioned Herodotus earlier.
Right, Herodotus. A key figure, his histories are foundational for Scaligerian chronology, but the geography he describes often does not concur easily with modern maps.
Like his claim about the Nile.
Yeah, his claim that the Nile runs parallel to the Ister, which is the Danube, they don't, obviously, and his descriptions of the Red Sea and surrounding areas. The new chronology argues these descriptions align much better with what they call inverted maps of the Middle Ages.
Inverted maps.
Yeah, sea charts, portolan charts. From maybe the 14th century onwards, they often had east at the top or on the left, and west on the right or bottom, oriented differently from our north-up convention. This inverted perspective, according to the theory, makes perfect sense if you're a Mediterranean seafarer sailing mostly north-south. They argue Herodotus's descriptions fit that kind of medieval navigational worldview better than a truly ancient, geographically accurate one based on our modern understanding.
So potentially Herodotus was working from medieval sources or perspectives, not ancient ones.
That's the provocative suggestion, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the Renaissance, that rebirth of classical antiquity after the Dark Ages. How does the new chronology view that?
Well, they have a pretty radical take on the Renaissance, too. They don't see it as a genuine rebirth of long-lost classical ideas after centuries of darkness. Instead, they view the Renaissance more as a product of the Scaligerian chronology itself. Almost like a convenient, perhaps even artificial epoch created to act as an archetypal recurrence of the classical age, neatly bridging the gap fabricated by the expanded timeline.
So not a real rebirth, but more like a historical illusion created by the timeline.
Something like that. They see it as suspiciously convenient, the sudden rediscovery of antiquity, right when Scaliger and others were constructing the timeline. And they point to what they call historical duplicates to support this.
Duplicates again, like the rulers.
Similar idea, yeah. You might find it curious, they say, that Scaligerian history presents us with two famous Homers.
Two Homers.
Yeah, the legendary ancient Greek poet, obviously, but also a medieval scholar named Homerus, who was apparently a poet at Charlemagne's court. Fomenko asks, are these really two different people centuries apart, or perhaps echoes of the same tradition or figure?
And other examples?
Well, there's the curious revival of Platonism in 15th century Florence, led by Plethoon.
Plethon, okay.
His name is phonetically quite similar to Plato, and also to Plotinus, the Neoplatonist philosopher. And isn't it interesting, they ask, that Plato's manuscripts were suddenly unearthed and became hugely influential right during Plethon's active period? Coincidence? Or is Plethon a later reflection of the Plato tradition?
Suggesting maybe the ancient Plato wasn't so ancient, or that Plethon was more central than just a reviver?
That's the kind of question they raise. They also note that supposedly ancient fables, like those of Aesop, or stories like Apuleius's The Golden Ass, these were apparently well developed by the medieval troubadours and were popular stories long before their supposed discovery as original classical texts during the Renaissance.
So the medieval versions came first, and the ancient ones were found later.
According to this theory, yes. It suggests these ancient works might simply be the well-known medieval narratives that were later rebranded as rediscovered classical originals to fit the new timeline.
What about major figures like Charlemagne? You mentioned Illig thought his era was suspect.
Right. The new chronology goes further and suggests Charlemagne might not even have been a personal name originally.
Not a name. Then what?
Most probably a title, they argue, meaning Charles the Great, or simply the Great King, Carolus Magnus, and they raise questions about who exactly was referred to by that title. Could it have been applied to multiple powerful rulers across Europe over a period whose reigns and exploits were later conflated by chroniclers into a single, massive, but possibly composite historical figure?
Wow, okay. That really dismantles a cornerstone of medieval history.
It does, and they look at medieval art for clues, too. Miniatures, sculptures.
What do they see in the art?
They point to things like medieval miniatures depicting, say, the mythical Trojan origins of the French kings. And in these pictures, the ancient Greeks and Trojans are shown dressed as
medieval knights.
Exactly. Full plate armor, medieval banners, the works, implying that the artists of the 15th century apparently didn't doubt the ancient figures to have been his historical contemporary. They drew Achilles like they'd draw a French knight.
No sense of historical distance or different clothing styles.
Seemingly not, in many examples they cite. Similarly, they point to sculptures in places like Chartres Cathedral, built in the 12th century. You find sculptures of supposedly ancient pagans like Aristotle and Pythagoras right alongside Christian saints on the cathedral facade. For the new chronology, this suggests a seamless integration of ancient and medieval characters in the medieval mind. Not a clear separation across vast gulfs of time, but contemporaries or near contemporaries in their understanding.
Okay, this links to another point you mentioned earlier, the issue of names and identities.
Right. Why did ancient people seem to have so many different names or aliases? The new chronology points out that in many ancient and medieval societies, people didn't necessarily have fixed, unique given names and surnames like we do today. They often use aliases, titles, or descriptive bynames that characterize them, like the Great, the Wise, the Bald. This, Fomenko argues, could easily lead chroniclers from different regions or writing in different languages to refer to the same ruler or figure by different names or titles.
And later historians, encountering these different names in different sources, mistook them for entirely distinct individuals.
Precisely, leading to the creation of historical duplicates, phantom rulers, or figures who are just aliases of someone else, artificially lengthening reigns and genealogies.
Can you give examples?
They cite Egyptian pharaohs with multiple throne names and personal names. Roman consuls often had 3 or 4 names. Even much later, Russian czars like Ivan III was also known as Timothy. It wasn't uncommon. And, intriguingly, they note that many names we now consider exclusively ancient Greek or Roman names were actually still in common use in the Byzantine Empire in the 12th to 14th centuries. They were worn by real people living in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries.
So the names themselves didn't disappear in a supposed dark age, blurring the lines again between what we label ancient and medieval.
That's the argument, yes. It questions the neat historical categorization.
One last specific example that caught my eye in the outline. Gladiator fights.
Yeah.
Surely those were exclusively ancient Roman.
You'd think so, right? Colosseum, lions, the whole deal, centuries BC or early AD. But the new chronology points to historical accounts, chronicles, that apparently describe gladiator fights happening in medieval Europe.
Medieval gladiator.
Yeah. For instance, they cite accounts from Naples around 1344 AD, describing public spectacles involving armed combatants fighting, sometimes to the death, exactly the way, the account says, they did in the ancient times.
So if you see a description of a gladiator fight, you shouldn't automatically assume it must be ancient Rome. It could be 14th century Naples.
That's the implication they draw, that cultural practices we rigidly assign to one ancient period might have persisted or occurred much later, challenging our assumptions based solely on the activity described.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground exploring the arguments and evidence presented by the new chronology. But now it's absolutely crucial, as we said at the start, to acknowledge the other side. How is this theory received by mainstream historians and scientists?
Right, and the reception is, to put it mildly, overwhelmingly negative. The new chronology is widely regarded by the academic community as pseudo-history. It's pretty much universally rejected by mainstream scholars.
Okay, pseudo-history is a strong term. What are the main criticisms leveled against Fomenko and his colleagues?
Well, critics accuse Fomenko primarily of being highly selective with historical sources and data. They say he ignores basic principles of sound scholarship, sometimes alters data, and consistently chooses only the information that supports his preconceived ideas. By doing this, they argue, he creates artificial, better-than-chance correlations. One major criticism is that he, quote, violates a key rule of statistics by selecting matches, while ignoring those which do not. Basically cherry-picking coincidences while disregarding all the data points that don't fit his theory.
So the statistical methods he uses are seen as flawed because of selection bias.
That's a major line of attack, yes. They argue his statistical proofs of historical duplicates are meaningless if you only count the hits and ignore the misses.
What about the dating methods? How do mainstream scientists respond to the critiques of radiocarbon, dendrochronology, etc.?
Mainstream scholars strongly contend that these methods, archaeological dating, dendrochronology, radiocarbon, have been significantly refined over decades. They emphasize the extensive cross-verification between different methods. For example, they'd point out that dendrochronology in some regions, like Ireland or Germany, provides continuous, unbroken sequences extending back thousands of years, well beyond the supposed 1000 AD gap Fomenko highlights for Europe generally. Some go back over 10,000 BCE when linked to geological varves.
So they say the gaps Fomenko mentions are either not there or have been bridged?
Correct. They argue the methods are far more robust and interconnected than Fomenko portrays. They also highlight that numismatists, coin experts, have made innumerable identifications of coins that link specific rulers depicted on them to specific historical events mentioned in written sources, things like joint coinage issued by family members ruling together. These finds are seen as strongly consistent with the traditional chronology and written records, contradicting the idea that coin dating is arbitrary or purely dependent on Scaliger.
So essentially, the mainstream view is that the checks and balances within and between different dating methods do work and confirm the conventional timeline, broadly speaking.
Yes, they argue that while there are always uncertainties and refinements, the overall structure of the Scaligerian chronology is robust and validated by multiple independent lines of evidence that Fomenko either ignores or misrepresents.
Has there been specific academic backlash? Reviews, responses?
Oh, absolutely. The new chronology has faced significant academic backlash. One review mentioned in the outline, by a professor of astronomy no less, called Fomenko's work surprising to say the least, and concluded the book was absolutely worthless. He even compared it to early Soviet attempts to produce tendentious science and of modern creationism. That gives you a sense of the level of dismissal in academic circles.
Pretty harsh. Any other perspectives on the criticism?
Well, the theory has also been viewed by some Western critics through a political lens, suggesting it might be part of a renewed Russian imperial ideology, perhaps aiming to recenter historical significance away from Western Europe, or to create a uniquely Russian historical narrative, though Fomenko himself frames it purely as a mathematical and scientific inquiry. And just to illustrate the general disdain, in 2004, Fomenko and his main collaborator Nosovsky actually received an anti-prize in Russia. It was for the worst book published in Russia in the rather pointed esteemed nonsense category.
Esteemed nonsense. Okay,
Yeah.
So clearly the academic world is not buying it, to put it mildly. But interestingly, there has been some, let's say, partial support or interest from outside academia. Gary Kasparov, the chess champion.
Yes, that's an interesting side note. Former world chess champion Gary Kasparov has popularized some aspects of the theory, particularly Fomenko's critiques of the conventional timeline. Kasparov apparently found Fomenko's conclusions about the so-called Dark Ages and the nature of the Renaissance aligning with his own gut feeling that art, culture, and science didn't just die out completely for centuries and then magically reappear.
So he agreed with the critique of the standard narrative.
He seemed to resonate with the idea that the traditional story of a long, empty Dark Age followed by a sudden Renaissance felt illogical. He questioned how the Byzantines, for example, could have failed to use the vast scientific knowledge supposedly left by ancient Greece and Rome, especially for military purposes, if it was readily available. He saw a continuity that traditional history sometimes obscures. However, and this is a crucial distinction, Kasparov explicitly stated that he does not support the reconstruction part of the new chronology.
Meaning he likes the critique, but not Fomenko's proposed alternative timeline.
Exactly. He doesn't necessarily agree with their specific redating of events to the Middle Ages or their claims about Russia being the center of a great empire, but he finds the questions they raise about the standard chronology compelling.
Okay, that's a nuanced position. Interesting. Right, so we've taken quite a journey here, a deep dive into the new chronology. It's a theory that, I think it's fair to say, radically reevaluates the entire timeline of human history. It challenges the very foundations of how we understand the past, doesn't it? Questioning everything from where our dating systems even came from to the authenticity of ancient texts, the reliability of scientific dating methods, and ultimately proposing that much of what we call ancient history might just be a kind of phantom reflection or duplication of medieval events.
Absolutely. And whether you find its arguments, compelling or completely controversial or maybe somewhere in between, the new chronology definitely compels us to think about the constructed nature of historical narratives. It really highlights the inherent complexities, the assumptions involved in dating events and artifacts across these vast spans of time. It forces us to ask, maybe, how much of the history we learn is truly objective fact, and how much is a narrative that's been built, refined, and sometimes maybe even distorted over centuries.
So a final thought to leave our listeners with. Could the historical events we've long held as bedrock fact simply be echoes of a more recent past, rearranged on a timeline by centuries of interpretation, calculation, maybe even deliberate manipulation? It certainly gives you something to mull over.